You think the 1970s were all about disco and bell-bottoms? Think again. American kitchens in that decade were churning out some of the most creative, convenience-driven, and surprisingly delicious pork chop innovations this country has ever seen. They're real recipes that fed real families across suburban America during an era of unprecedented culinary experimentation. Let's dig into 25 forgotten pork chop recipes from the 1970s that have completely vanished from modern dinner tables. Shake and bake pork chops. When General Foods launched Shake and Bake in 1965, it exploded throughout the 70s as the ultimate working mother's secret weapon. The magic was deceptively simple. Dump the seasoned breadcrumb mixture into the included plastic bag, toss in thick-cut bone-in pork chops, seal it up, and let your kids shake it like a maraca. The coating was a precisely engineered blend of breadcrumbs, paprika, garlic powder, and mysterious secret spices that turned golden brown and impossibly crispy in the oven. After 25 minutes at 400 degrees on a foil-lined sheet pan, you'd pull out pork chops with a crunchy, savory crust that rivaled anything from a diner, with juicy meat underneath that hadn't been touched by a drop of frying oil. This wasn't just dinner. It was liberation in a box, promising restaurant quality without the mess of frying during an era when women were flooding into the workforce. Today's air fryer obsession? It's basically trying to recreate what Shake and Bake perfected 50 years ago. If you're enjoying this journey through food history, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss future videos. Cream of mushroom pork chop casserole. Before foodie culture declared condensed soup passé, the cream of mushroom pork chop casserole was the centerpiece of countless Wednesday night dinners across America. The recipe was pure 1970s efficiency. Brown 4 thick pork chops in a cast iron skillet until they developed a golden crust. Then nestle them into a baking dish with sliced onions and quartered potatoes. Pour 2 cans of Campbell's cream of mushroom soup, undiluted, mind you, directly over everything. Add a splash of milk to loosen it up and slide it into a 350-degree oven for an hour. What emerged was fork-tender pork swimming in a thick, savory gravy studded with mushroom pieces, the meat practically falling off the bone. The onions melted into sweet submission, while the potatoes soaked up every drop of that umami-rich sauce. This was comfort food engineering at its finest. Minimal effort, maximum satisfaction, and exactly one dish to wash. Today's dump dinners are just reinventing what Grandma knew all along. Hawaiian pork chops. The tiki craze of the 60s crashed straight into 70s home cooking with Hawaiian pork chops, a dish that convinced suburban Americans they were dining in a Polynesian paradise. Start by browning bone-in chops until caramelized, then create the Hawaiian magic. Drain a can of pineapple rings, but save that syrup like liquid gold. Mix the syrup with soy sauce, brown sugar, a splash of vinegar, and a generous shake of ground ginger to create a glossy, sweet and salty glaze. Arrange the brown chops in a baking dish, top each with a pineapple ring secured with a toothpick, and pour that glorious glaze over everything. Bake at 350 degrees for 40 minutes, basting occasionally until the pork glistened like a sunset over Waikiki and the pineapple edges caramelized to candy. Serve it over white rice, and suddenly your split-level ranch house felt like a beachfront bungalow. This was exotic eating for families who'd never left their home state, bringing tropical fantasy to the Midwest dinner table, one sticky sweet bite at a time. Pork chops and sauerkraut. German heritage met American convenience in this Pennsylvania Dutch-inspired staple that graced tables from Pittsburgh to the Dakotas. The beauty was in its rustic simplicity. Layer the bottom of a heavy Dutch oven with a thick bed of drained sauerkraut, the tangy, fermented cabbage that came in jars or cans at every grocery store. Nestle thick-cut pork chops directly into that sauerkraut nest. Season with caraway seeds, black pepper, and maybe some sliced apples for sweetness. Add a cup of beer or apple cider, clamp on the lid, and let it braise low and slow for 2 hours until the pork turned fall-apart tender and the sauerkraut mellowed into sweet, sour perfection. The The pork fat rendered into the kraut, creating this incredibly rich, tangy sauce that tasted like old-world comfort. This wasn't fancy cooking. It was the kind of one-pot meal that German and Eastern European immigrants had been making for generations, adapted for busy American families who needed dinner to cook itself while they lived their lives. Sweet and sour pork chops. When Chinese-American takeout became a nationwide obsession in the 70s, home cooks desperately wanted to recreate those flavors without leaving their kitchens. Sweet and sour pork chops were the answer, a simplified version that traded wok skills for straightforward baking. Brown your chops in a skillet to get some color, then make the sauce that defined a generation. Ketchup. Yes, ketchup. Brown sugar, white vinegar, and soy sauce whisked together into a thick, glossy, candy-colored coating. Some recipes added crushed pineapple or diced bell peppers for authenticity. Pour this magical concoction over the chops in a baking dish and roast at 350 degrees for 45 minutes, the sauce reducing into a sticky glaze that coated every inch of meat. The result was tender pork with a flavor profile that hit every taste bud. Sweet, sour, salty, umami, all at once. It wasn't authentic Chinese cooking, but it satisfied America's craving for exotic flavors without requiring specialty ingredients or techniques. Pork chops and rice casserole. This was the ultimate set-it-and-forget-it dinner that turned skeptical husbands into believers. Start with a layer of uncooked, long-grain white rice spread across the bottom of a 9 by 13 baking dish. Yes, uncooked, straight from the box. Arrange browned pork chops on top of that raw rice like you're tucking them into bed. Here's where it gets good. Mix a can of cream of mushroom soup with a can of cream of chicken soup. Thin it out with 2 cups of water or chicken broth and pour this mixture over everything. The liquid needs to cover the rice completely. Season the chops with salt, pepper, and paprika. Seal the dish tightly with foil and bake at 350 degrees for 90 minutes. During that time, the rice absorbed all the liquid, the soups melded into a creamy sauce, and the pork chops steamed to perfect tenderness. One dish, complete meal, zero babysitting required. This was the recipe working mothers photocopied and passed around like contraband. French onion pork chops. When Lipton's French onion soup mix hit American pantries in the 1950s, it took another decade for home cooks to realize its true potential, turning ordinary pork chops into something that tasted like you'd slaved over a French bistro stove all day. The method was absurdly simple. Brown, thick-cut chops in butter until golden, creating those beautiful caramelized bits stuck to the bottom of your skillet. Remove the meat, toss in sliced onions, and let them soften in that porky butter. Sprinkle an entire envelope of Lipton's French onion soup mix over those onions. That magical blend of dehydrated onions, beef bouillon, and mysterious umami powder. Add a splash of water or white wine to deglaze, scraping up all those browned bits. Nestle the chops back in, reduce the heat, and braise everything for 30 minutes until the onions turned jammy and the sauce thickened into liquid gold. The result tasted like slow-cooked French onion soup had a baby with perfectly cooked pork. Breaded pork chops. Before shake and bake promised convenience, there was the ritual of hand-breading pork chops, a technique every 70s cook learned from their mother. Set up your breading station like an assembly line. A shallow dish of seasoned flour, a bowl of beaten eggs mixed with a splash of milk, and a plate of fine breadcrumbs seasoned with salt, pepper, garlic powder, and paprika. Dredge each thick-cut chop through flour. Dip into the egg wash, then press firmly into those breadcrumbs until coated like armor. The key was letting them rest for 10 minutes so the coating could set up properly. Heat a cast iron skillet with a 1/4 inch of vegetable oil until it shimmered. Then fry those chops for 5 minutes per side until the crust turned deep golden brown and audibly crackled. The result was a crunchy, savory shell giving way to juicy, tender pork inside. This was the original fried chicken experience applied to pork. Comfort food that required real skill and attention. Pork chop and potato bake. This Midwestern church supper staple combined two family favorites into one glorious pan. Slice 4 large russet potatoes into rounds about a 1/4 inch thick. Not too thin or they'd disintegrate, not too thick or they wouldn't cook through. Layer half those potatoes in a greased 9 by 13 baking dish, season generously with salt and pepper, then arrange browned pork chops over the top. Cover the chops with the remaining potato slices, creating a potato-pork-potato sandwich situation. Now for the magic. Mix a can of cream of celery soup with half a cup of milk and a handful of shredded cheddar cheese, creating this rich, cheesy sauce that you'd pour over everything. Dot the top with butter pats, cover with foil, and bake at 375 degrees for an hour. Remove the foil for the last 15 minutes to let the top potatoes crisp up and brown. Apple stuffed pork chops. When pork chop recipes called for stuffing, they weren't messing around. They meant actual pockets carved into thick-cut chops like edible purses. Using a sharp paring knife, you'd cut a horizontal slit into the side of each 2-inch thick chop, creating a cavity without cutting all the way through. The stuffing was autumn in a bowl. Diced Granny Smith apples, day-old bread cubes, diced onion, celery, a handful of raisins, and a shower of cinnamon and sage. Sauté this mixture until fragrant, then stuff it into those pork pockets, securing with toothpicks if needed. Brown the stuffed chops in butter on both sides to seal in the filling, then finish in a 350-degree oven for 40 minutes. The apples would soften and release their juices, mingling with the pork fat to create this sweet, savory filling that tasted like Thanksgiving met a pork chop. This was special occasion cooking, too fussy for weeknights but perfect for impressing dinner guests who thought they'd seen everything. Pineapple pork chops with soy glaze. The 70s loved pineapple on everything, and this recipe took the Hawaiian pork chop concept into darker, more sophisticated territory with the addition of soy sauce and garlic. Start by creating a marinade that would make your taste buds stand at attention. Crushed pineapple with its juice, soy sauce, minced garlic, brown sugar, and a splash of rice vinegar if you were fancy enough to have it. Marinate thick-cut chops for at least 2 hours, preferably overnight, letting those flavors penetrate deep into the meat. When ready to cook, remove the chops and boil down that marinade until it reduced to a thick, glossy glaze that coated the back of a spoon. Grill or pan fry the chops until beautifully charred, then brush them with that concentrated glaze multiple times during cooking. The result was pork with a caramelized crust, sweet and salty in equal measure, with a depth of flavor that transcended its simple ingredients. This was backyard barbecue meets Polynesian restaurant, and it made grown men weep with joy. Golden mushroom soup pork chops. Campbell's golden mushroom soup was the sophisticated cousin of cream of mushroom, deeper, richer, with an almost beefy undertone that elevated everything it touched. This recipe was almost too easy to be as good as it tasted. Brown your pork chops in a skillet until golden, then set them aside. In that same skillet with all those browned bits, dump an entire can of golden mushroom soup straight from the can. No water, no milk, nothing. Let it heat up and loosen, scraping the bottom to incorporate all that fond. Nestle the chops back into that thick, luxurious sauce, add sliced mushrooms if you wanted to go wild, and let everything simmer together for 30 minutes. The soup would reduce and concentrate, clinging to the meat like velvet. Serve this over egg noodles or mashed potatoes, and you had a meal that tasted like you'd been working on it all day. The secret was that golden soup. It did all the heavy lifting while you did none of the work. Onion soup mix pork chops. Lipton's onion soup mix was the magic ingredient that saved countless dinners in the 1970s, and nowhere did it shine brighter than sprinkled over pork chops. The genius was in the simplicity. Place your chops in a baking dish, sprinkle the entire contents of one soup mix packet directly over them like fairy dust, add a cup of water to the bottom of the pan, cover tightly with foil, and bake at 350 degrees for an hour. During that time, the dehydrated onions rehydrated and softened, the bouillon dissolved into a rich gravy, and those mysterious secret seasonings infused every fiber of the meat. When you pulled that foil back, you'd find pork chops swimming in golden brown gravy thick enough to coat a spoon, with caramelized onion bits studding every bite. The chops would be so tender they'd fall apart with a fork, and that gravy demanded to be soaked up by mashed potatoes or rice. This was the recipe desperate mothers made on nights when they'd forgotten to plan dinner, and it never failed to impress. Stuffed pork chops with sauerkraut. This was the German-American answer to fancy French cuisine. Rustic, hearty, and unapologetically porky. Start with thick-cut bone-in chops, at least 2 inches thick, and carve a pocket into each one just like the apple-stuffed version. But instead of sweet apples, stuff these cavities with sauerkraut that you'd squeezed dry and mixed with caraway seeds, diced onion, and crumbled cooked bacon. The filling was tangy, smoky, and intensely savory. Secure the pockets with toothpicks, brown the chops in bacon fat until crusty, then braise them in a covered skillet with beer and a little brown sugar for balance. After an hour of low and slow cooking, the sauerkraut filling would mellow and sweeten, the pork would turn spoon tender, and the braising liquid would reduce to a tangy sweet sauce. Bavarian pork chops with apples. This recipe brought Oktoberfest vibes to suburban American kitchens, combining German technique with ingredients from any grocery store. Start by browning thick bone-in chops in butter, getting them nice and golden on both sides. Remove them, then sauté sliced onions and tart apple wedges. Granny Smith's worked perfectly, until they started to soften. Deglaze the pan with apple cider or beer, scraping up all those flavorful browned bits. Add the chops back in, season with caraway seeds and a touch of brown sugar, then cover and simmer everything together for 35 minutes. The apples would break down slightly, creating a chunky sauce that was both sweet and tangy, while the onions melted into silky strands. The pork absorbed all those flavors, becoming tender enough to cut with a fork. Serve with braised red cabbage and spätzle if you really wanted to commit to the theme, or just pile it over mashed potatoes and call it dinner. This was comfort food with an accent, bringing old-world warmth to new-world convenience. Parmesan pork chops. When Italian-American food conquered suburban dinner tables, this recipe became the pork chop equivalent of chicken Parmesan, minus the tomato sauce that would make it too familiar. The preparation followed the classic breading protocol. Dredge chops in flour, dip in beaten eggs, then press into a mixture of Italian breadcrumbs and freshly grated Parmesan cheese. The ratio mattered. Equal parts breadcrumbs and Parmesan created maximum cheesy crust. Some cooks added dried basil and oregano to the breading for extra Italian credentials. Pan-fry these breaded beauties in olive oil until the coating turned golden and crispy, with the Parmesan creating these lacy, crispy edges that shattered when you bit into them. The cheese flavor was concentrated and nutty, elevating the humble pork chop into something that felt restaurant-worthy. Squeeze fresh lemon over the top just before serving to cut through the richness. This was Italian technique applied to an American staple, creating something that felt sophisticated but required nothing more than pantry ingredients and basic cooking skills. Glazed pork chops with apple and orange. This recipe took the apple-pork combination and elevated it with citrus brightness, creating a glaze that balanced sweet, tart, and savory in perfect harmony. Start by creating the glaze. Combine orange marmalade, apple jelly, a splash of cider vinegar, and whole grain mustard in a saucepan, heating until everything melted together into liquid gold. Brown thick-cut chops in a heavy skillet, then brush them generously with that glaze. Add sliced apples and orange segments to the pan around the chops. Drizzle more glaze over everything, and finish in a 350-degree oven for 30 minutes. As it cooked, the glaze would caramelize on the pork, creating this shiny, sticky coating that caught the light. The fruit softened and absorbed the glaze, becoming sweet tart accompaniments that were almost like chunky jam. The mustard provided just enough tangy bite to prevent the sweetness from overwhelming. This was elegant enough for company, but easy enough for a weeknight, transforming ordinary ingredients into something that looked like it came from a country inn menu. Beer-braised pork chops. When men finally got interested in cooking during the 70s, recipes that involved beer suddenly proliferated, and this one actually had a legitimate culinary pedigree. Brown, thick, bone-in chops in a cast-iron skillet until deeply caramelized. Then remove them and build your braising liquid. Sauté sliced onions in the pork fat until golden. Add minced garlic, then pour in a full bottle of beer. Lager or ale, nothing too hoppy, along with a spoonful of brown sugar and a few dashes of Worcestershire sauce. Return the chops to the pan, nestling them into that beer-onion mixture. Cover and let everything simmer for an hour on low heat. The beer reduced down, concentrating into a rich, slightly bitter sauce that tasted complex and sophisticated. The onions practically dissolved, thickening the liquid, while the pork absorbed all those malty flavors and turned fork tender. Serve this with crusty bread to soak up the sauce, and suddenly your Wednesday night dinner tasted like something from a German beer hall. This was man cooking at its finest. Simple, boozy, and undeniably delicious. Orange ginger pork chops. The 70s obsession with ginger was real, and this recipe showcased the root's ability to add warmth and complexity to simple proteins. Create a marinade that would wake up your taste buds. Orange juice, freshly grated ginger, about a tablespoon's worth. Soy sauce, brown sugar, and a squeeze of fresh garlic. The ginger was crucial. It needed to be fresh, not the dried powder from your spice rack, to deliver that bright, zingy heat. Marinate your chops for at least 4 hours, turning them occasionally so every surface got coated. When ready to cook, remove the chops and reduce the marinade down to a thick glaze in a small saucepan. Grill or pan-sear the chops, brushing with that reduced glaze multiple times to build up layers of flavor. The ginger would caramelize slightly, creating these savory sweet bits on the pork's surface, while the orange provided fruity brightness that cut through the meat's richness. This was Asian-inspired cooking before fusion became a buzzword, bringing sophisticated flavors to suburban kitchens, one ginger root at a time. Campbell's cream of vegetable pork chops. Campbell's didn't stop at mushroom soup. They had an entire line of condensed vegetable soups that 70s cooks weaponized for dinner. This recipe worked with cream of celery, cream of asparagus, or even the exotic cream of broccoli. The method was the same regardless. Brown your chops, place them in a baking dish, dump the entire can of soup over them undiluted, add a splash of milk to thin it slightly, and bake covered at 350 degrees for 50 minutes. Each soup created a completely different flavor profile. Celery was mild and earthy. Asparagus added springtime brightness. Broccoli brought a subtle vegetal sweetness. The soup would break down during cooking, creating this creamy sauce that coated every inch of pork. The vegetables in the soup, though reduced to near-invisible specks, still contributed flavor and gave the illusion of a complete meal. This was convenience cooking at its absolute peak. Open can, pour, bake, eat. No one questioned whether it was real cooking because it tasted too good to care. Tomato soup pork chops. Before marinara sauce dominated American kitchens, Campbell's tomato soup provided the tomato flavor for countless dishes. This recipe turned that familiar red soup into a tangy sweet sauce that somehow worked perfectly with pork. Brown your chops to get good color, then set them aside while you built the sauce in the same pan. Pour in a can of condensed tomato soup. No water added, along with a tablespoon of Worcestershire sauce, a spoonful of brown sugar, and a splash of vinegar for brightness. Some cooks added diced green peppers and onions for texture and flavor. Return the chops to this tomato mixture, cover, and simmer for 40 minutes until the pork turned tender and the sauce reduced to a thick, ketchup-like consistency that clung to the meat. The flavor was nostalgic and comforting, somewhere between meatloaf and sweet and sour pork, with that unmistakable Campbell's tomato soup taste that defined childhood lunches. This was poverty cooking that tasted like love, turning the cheapest ingredients into something the whole family devoured. Creamy pork chop and mushroom casserole. This wasn't just pork chops with mushroom soup. This was a full-on casserole situation with layers, textures, and complexity that belied its simple origins. Start with browned pork chops as your base. Layer them in a baking dish. Then add sautéed fresh mushrooms, sliced buttons or creminis, about 2 cups worth. Mix cream of mushroom soup with sour cream and a splash of white wine, creating this luxuriously rich sauce that you'd pour over everything. Top with buttered breadcrumbs mixed with Parmesan cheese for textural contrast. Bake uncovered at 375 degrees for 45 minutes until the top turned golden and crispy while the underneath stayed creamy and luscious. The fresh mushrooms added earthy depth that the canned soup alone couldn't provide, while the sour cream gave it a tangy richness. The breadcrumb topping was essential. It provided crunch and prevented the whole thing from being too one-note creamy. This was casserole evolution, taking the basic cream of soup method and adding just enough extra steps to make it feel special. German-style pork chops with sauerkraut and bacon. This was the ultimate expression of German-American pork cookery. Layers of flavor built through pork on pork on pork. Start by frying thick-cut bacon until crispy. Then remove it and brown your pork chops in that rendered bacon fat. Remove the chops, add sliced onions to the fat, and cook until softened. Now layer everything in a Dutch oven or deep baking dish. Start with a bed of drained sauerkraut mixed with those softened onions. Nestle the brown chops on top, crumble the crispy bacon over everything, and add caraway seeds, juniper berries if you were authentic, and a pour of beer or chicken stock. Cover tightly and braise in a 325-degree oven for 2 hours until the pork turned impossibly tender and the sauerkraut mellowed into sweet tart perfection. The bacon added smoky depth, the pork fat enriched the kraut, and the low and slow cooking melted everything together into German-American harmony. Serve with boiled potatoes and spicy brown mustard, and you had a meal that would satisfy the hungriest farmer or factory worker. Cream of celery pork chops. The underrated cousin in Campbell's condensed soup family, cream of celery brought a subtle, sophisticated flavor that let the pork shine without overwhelming it. This recipe was elegant simplicity. Brown your chops until golden, arrange them in a baking dish, and pour an entire can of cream of celery soup over them, undiluted for maximum creaminess. Add a splash of milk and a generous grinding of black pepper. Cover with foil and bake at 350 degrees for an hour. During that time, the soup would thin out into a silky sauce. The celery flavor, mild and slightly earthy, would infuse into the pork, and everything would become fork tender. The key was not overcooking. You wanted the sauce to stay creamy rather than breaking. Serve this over rice or egg noodles, letting them soak up that delicate celery cream sauce. This was refined comfort food for people who found mushroom soup too assertive and wanted something gentler. It proved that sometimes the quietest flavors are the most memorable, especially when executed perfectly. Pepperoni rolls. Back in 1927, Italian immigrant Giuseppe Argiro opened a bakery in Fairmont, West Virginia, right in the heart of coal country. The miners had a problem. They needed lunches that could survive 12-hour shifts in hot, dusty mines without spoiling. Argiro's solution became a West Virginia institution. He took soft bread dough, wrapped it around sticks of pepperoni, and baked them until golden. The pepperoni's natural oils and salt acted as preservatives, while the sealed dough package kept out coal dust and mine grime. You'd roll out simple white bread dough, place a whole 6-inch pepperoni stick in the center, sometimes add a slice of mozzarella, then roll it tight and bake until golden brown. When a miner bit into one deep underground, he got that spicy, greasy, salty punch of meat and bread that made black coffee taste like luxury. This wasn't fancy food. It was survival food that could handle 100-degree tunnels without refrigeration. If you're enjoying this journey through food history, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss future videos. Fried green tomatoes. When frost threatened in September, mountain families stripped their tomato plants of every unripe fruit. Waste wasn't an option. These hard, sour green tomatoes became a staple in lunch pails across Appalachia from the 1890s onward. The preparation was simple but required skill. You'd slice the green tomatoes thick, about a ½ inch, so they wouldn't fall apart. Dip them in buttermilk if you had it, or just water if you didn't, then dredge through cornmeal mixed with salt and pepper. Some families added a little flour to help the coating stick. Into a hot skillet with bacon grease they'd go, frying until each side developed a crispy, golden brown crust. The heat would soften the tomato just enough to create a contrast, crunchy outside, tangy and firm inside. These weren't just clever, they were strategic. Fried green tomatoes could sit at room temperature all morning without getting soggy or spoiling. Loggers and miners would eat them cold, straight from the pail, enjoying that sharp, acidic bite that cut through the heaviness of biscuits and fatback. Stack cake slices. The Appalachian stack cake wasn't just dessert. It was portable wealth in the lunch pail. Dating back to the early 1800s, this cake was made from thin layers of dense, cookie-like rounds stacked with dried apple filling. But here's what made it lunch-worthy. It actually got better with age. Families would bake these cakes a week before they were needed, letting the moisture from the apple filling seep into the dry layers, softening them into something almost fudgy. A mother would cut thick slices and wrap them in wax paper for the lunch pail. Each layer was made from sorghum or molasses-sweetened dough, rolled thin and baked hard, creating rounds that could survive being transported without crumbling. Between each layer went a thick paste of dried apples, cooked down with sugar and spices until it was almost jammy. The beauty was in the preservation. The low moisture content meant it wouldn't mold. The sugar and spice acted as preservatives, and the whole thing could sit in a cool place for weeks. Miners and loggers savored these slices as their midday treat, the dense sweetness providing quick energy and a taste of home in rough camps. Old biscuits with sorghum. Leftover biscuits never went to waste in the mountains. From the 1880s through the 1960s, families would save the previous night's biscuits for next-day lunches. These weren't the fluffy, buttery southern biscuits you'd find at a restaurant. These were hard-working biscuits made with lard and minimal rising agent, designed to fill stomachs cheaply. By morning, they'd be cold and slightly firm, but that was the point. A worker would split the biscuit in half and drizzle dark sorghum molasses over each side. Sorghum was cheaper than white sugar and provided deep, almost earthy sweetness with a mineral tang that white sugar couldn't match. The thick syrup would soak into the dense biscuit, creating pockets of sweetness throughout. Some folks added a smear of butter if they had it, but most just relied on the sorghum. This combination delivered quick energy from the molasses and staying power from the wheat and lard. Timber workers would eat these standing up, syrup dripping onto their boots, getting that sugar rush before attacking another day of felling trees with handsaws and axes in the steep mountain terrain. Salmon patties. Canned salmon was one of the few luxury proteins mountain families could afford, and they stretched it as far as possible. From the 1920s through the 1960s, salmon patties became a lunch staple. The night before, mothers would open a can of pink salmon, bones and skin included, nothing wasted, and mash it with leftover cornbread or stale breadcrumbs, an egg if available, and a little chopped onion. Form the mixture into patties and fry them in bacon grease until both sides developed a crispy, golden crust. By morning, these patties were cold and firm, perfect for the lunch pail. They wouldn't fall apart, wouldn't spoil in moderate temperatures, and delivered that fish oil richness that bodies needed. The bones, mashed in with everything else, provided calcium that mountain diets often lacked. Workers would eat them with their hands, the crispy exterior giving way to that soft, fishy center. Some folks made them small, like silver dollar pancakes. Others preferred them larger, like hamburger patties. Either way, they represented prosperity in a can. Ocean fish making its way to landlocked hollows, providing protein when deer season was over and the chickens weren't laying. Dried apple slices. Simple, portable, and nearly indestructible. From the late 1700s onward, Appalachian families dried apples every fall as insurance against winter and spring hunger. They'd core and slice apples thin, usually golden delicious or wine saps, and string them on thread or lay them on screens in the sun, sometimes in the rafters near the wood stove. After weeks of drying, the slices would shrink to leathery rings, concentrated with sugar and flavor. These went into every lunch pail. Workers would chew them slowly, rehydrating them slightly with saliva, releasing that intense apple sweetness. They were tough. You couldn't just bite through them. You had to gnaw and suck, making each piece last. The chewing motion itself was satisfying, giving jaw muscles something to do during breaks. These dried apples provided quick energy from natural sugars, required no refrigeration, wouldn't spoil for months, and weighed almost nothing. Loggers would carry pounds of them into week-long camps. Miners kept them in their pockets. Children would get a handful for school. In lean times, these apple rings might be the only sweet thing a family had, making them precious beyond their simple ingredients. Pickled eggs and cornbread. When chickens were laying heavily in spring and summer, mountain families pickled dozens of eggs to preserve them for leaner months. They'd hard-boil fresh eggs, peel them, and pack them into jars filled with vinegar brine, sometimes with beet juice for color, sometimes with hot peppers for bite. After a week in the brine, these eggs transformed into tangy, firm protein bombs. For lunch, a worker would grab 2 or 3 pickled eggs and a chunk of cornbread. The combination was strategic. The sharp, acidic punch of the vinegar egg cut through the dense, slightly sweet cornbread, creating a balanced meal that sat well in the stomach. The eggs provided protein and fat, the cornbread delivered carbohydrates, and the vinegar aided digestion during heavy labor. From the 1880s through the 1960s, this pairing was standard in coal camps and tobacco fields. The eggs were sour, salty, and had that distinctive pickled firmness. The yolk would be slightly dry and crumbly. Men would eat them whole, alternating bites of egg with bites of crumbling cornbread, washing everything down with creek water or weak coffee from a thermos. Bean sandwiches. Yes, beans between bread. This wasn't a joke, it was serious fuel. The night before, leftover pinto beans would be mashed slightly with a fork, creating a thick paste that could spread. In the morning, this bean paste went between 2 slices of bread, usually that thick, homemade farm bread that could handle moisture without disintegrating. No lettuce, no tomato, no condiments. Just beans and bread. The beans provided protein and fiber, the bread gave carbohydrates, and the whole thing could survive hours in a lunch pail without falling apart. Some families added a little bacon grease to the beans for moisture and flavor. Others included a slice of raw onion for bite. From the 1900s through the 1960s, bean sandwiches sustained workers who couldn't afford meat daily. The sandwich was filling, cheap, and surprisingly satisfying. The beans' earthy, creamy texture contrasted with the bread's density. It stuck to your ribs, as the saying went, meaning it kept you full for hours of hard labor. Modern folks might turn their noses up, but to a tobacco farmer in 1935, this sandwich represented a full belly and the energy to finish a 12-hour day in the fields.